All right, well, thank you, everyone. Just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm also from the United States, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the same topics, but from a different perspective. I teach at Texas Tech University, and we have a free market institute there as well. We basically promote the ideas of free markets all year long. We have undergraduate reading groups. We have actually high school seminars and undergrad seminars that everyone's invited to. We actually recently just had a bunch of students in from Guatemala for a week-long or a weekend-long seminar to talk about free markets. So it's an exciting place to be if you're interested in these ideas. But today I'm going to talk a little bit. First, I'm going to talk about it being a divided world and a troubled times, but putting it to a relative perspective of what times used to be like. I actually just read an article the other day that talks about how people wish they were billionaires, or how you would never want to be a billionaire, in the early 1900s. Okay. Development has changed dramatically in recent years. And so this is a graph that a lot of economists use. You'll notice it starts at year 1 and goes straight to 1600. The reason it does that is because development was essentially flat for all those years. And then all of a sudden you saw this enormous increase in growth. So yes, we might be heading in the wrong direction today, but we're relatively better off than we used to be. And you can see this in recent years as well. Pretty much every category of income has doubled, and we'll look at low income so you can see that a little better. So things are getting better. Things are getting better for the poor as well. There's less people in poverty, and it's also easier to live in poverty now. That sounds like a weird thing to say, but everything's cleaner, it's a little bit better, and you'll see that with something as simple as access to clean energy to cook with. Okay, that's also changed dramatically, so people aren't getting sick just by making food anymore. So why do I bring this up? Because at least in the United States, people seem to be being very dramatic about things. Everything's very angry. There's a lot of heated discussions. It's really hard to even have a civil conversation anymore. And actually at Texas Tech, we're starting a group where we're forcing civil conversations and reminding students that it's okay to disagree as long as you do it civilly. But the point is, it's not that bad. We can have these conversations and still be a little bit optimistic. The world's not going to end. Okay? But to get back to the issue of income inequality, because this is all I've been really hearing about in the recent election, and this is something I research myself, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. There has been a slight increase in inequality, but if we look at this more recent graph, we'll see that the distribution of people in the poorest category has actually fallen, but the distribution of people in every other category has actually increased. Now, the interesting thing I want to add on to Dan's talk is the fact that in the United States, we kind of equate the increase in inequality with the wrong thing. Okay, so he was talking about how people aren't necessarily concerned about equality, they're concerned about fairness in outcomes if they think that the person cheated their way there. But the problem is, what I've been noticing is people have been equating that mechanism with capitalism. And that's just not true. That's not what a free market is. So there's a couple of threats to free markets, and we're going to get into trade in the next panel. But one of the biggest threats in my mind is the idea of capitalism versus crony capitalism. And crony capitalism is what we have in the United States more so than anything else today, or at least the problems I hear people talking about capitalism. They're not talking about capitalism at all. So you see in this graph there's a slight uptick in inequality for the United States. It's the yellow line. What you also see, if I put another graph up here, is that the level of markets or economic freedom, or in another term, the ability to own your own land and make decisions for yourself, essentially a measure of capitalism, has gone down in those same years. So while we're seeing an increase in inequality, we're seeing a decrease in the dependence on markets. Okay. And you see this general trend for countries overall. So this is just a scatter plot of a bunch of different countries. Every country I could find data on that has an economic freedom score, which is just a measure of capitalism, and an inequality score. And these inequality scores have troubles in their own, and I can talk about that if I have time. But the general trend is negative. So the more capitalism you have, the less inequality you also have. Okay. And why is this so? Well, it gets to Dr. Mitchell's idea of not fairness in people that become rich. And this is mainly because of things like corruption. In the United States, it's legal to rent seek. You can lobby, but there's a pretty thin line between what rent seeking is and what corruption is. So corruption is just an illegal form, but it's still the same activity. So rather than focusing on being productive, you have firms focusing on extracting rents. So not only is that going to decrease your income overall, but that's going to benefit those who have political connections and hurt those that do not. Okay. This is just to talk about how central or how common corruption actually is, especially in developing countries, but it exists in the United States as well. This is an economist that studies corruption, and he does a lot of field work. So he goes to different countries and surveys them. In Thailand, he surveyed a well-off CEO and asked him about his relationship with the government and their regulations. And the CEO exclaimed, "I hope to be reborn as a custom official." And this is a low-ranking custom official. These are not individuals that make a lot of money, but he wants to be reborn as, instead of a CEO, as a customs official. And the reason is they have the ability to extract a lot of bribes out of these firms and individuals. And when you have that, and you have a system with regulations that allows that, you're going to have a lot of unequal outcomes. Okay, and this is a graph of inequality and corruption, and you see it's a pretty significant positive relationship. Countries that have the most corruption also have the most inequality. The example that I'm most familiar with, because it's one country I've researched quite a bit, is Brazil. And Brazil is probably the most unequal country in the world. They have some of the richest people in the world, and they also have some people that are not very well off. It's actually fascinating to look at their income distribution. About 60% is allocated to 1% of their population. So 60% of Brazil's income is allocated to 1% of their people. And they also have a ton of corruption. And I'm not talking about the big scandals you've heard. They have a lot of local level corruption. It's just a common thing there. I have a colleague that is from Brazil, and he tells me some scary stories. So it's a real issue. Okay. And then this is just one graph I wanted to show just to give you an idea of what the top 10 least corrupt countries are and the top 10 most corrupt countries, which will be on the next slide. I want you to take note the United States is not in the top 10 least corrupt. Okay, so there is a lot more corruption than people think, again, in the United States. Okay, and then these are just the top 10 most corrupt. Again, there's as you would expect. Okay, we see corruption's also associated with a lot of bad outcomes, so things like income, things like life expectancy, things like human development, which is, this has a combination of income, welfare, well-being, happiness. But the most interesting finding is that corruption is negatively related to capitalism. If you have more freedom in the market, you have less corruption. There's less opportunities to extract bribes. There's less opportunities to engage in extortion and policy manipulation and this whole vicious cycle of a corrupt game. Okay, go back to that later. So where do we go from here? In the U.S., I would suggest us going back and making sure everyone understands what capitalism is. It seems to be equated with the wrong thing today. And emphasizing the importance of markets and how markets can actually reduce corruption, and that's a whole different story altogether. But markets work in a sense that they not only provide less opportunities for corruption, they make corruption harder. If we don't have a society that has free markets, it's very, very easy to be corrupt. Okay. Thank you.